The wind came down off the ridge the way it always did in late October, thin and cold and smelling faintly of snow that hadn't fallen yet. The old woman stood at the fence line with both hands on the top rail, looking down at the valley the way she looked at most things now, slow, and like she'd already seen the end of it. The niece stood beside her, boots sinking a little in the wet grass, waiting the way young people wait when they think patience is a performance. "That stick by your door," the niece said. "The one with all the notches. Aunt Lucretia said you'd never tell anyone what it was for." The old woman didn't answer right away. Down below, cattle moved slow and dark against the pale grass, small as beads from this height. Smoke rose from the chimney of the house they'd left 20 minutes before, thin and straight in the still air. "It's a tally stick," she said finally. "For what?" "For a debt." The niece waited for more. The old woman gave her nothing else. Not yet. She turned from the fence and started back down the slope, and the girl fell into step beside her because there was nothing else to do. "I'll tell it," the old woman said, "but I'll tell it once. I'm not in the habit of repeating myself, and I'm too old to start." "Tell what?" "What the stick's for." They walked without speaking for a while, the grass hissing against their skirts, the mountain rising up gray and patient behind them. The old woman's eyes had gone somewhere else already, somewhere the girl couldn't follow yet. 32 years ago," the old woman said, "I had 1 sack of grain to my name, and a herd of cattle stuck up on that mountain, with a storm coming in behind them." The niece looked up at the peak, as if she might see the storm still sitting there, waiting. "1 sack," she repeated. "1 sack, and a man came through town who could bring cattle down off a mountain nobody else would touch. Everybody knew his name for that, and nothing else." The old woman's mouth moved, not quite a smile. "He wanted 2 sacks for the work." "What did you do?" "I had one," the old woman said, as if that answered it. And for a moment it seemed like it might have to. They reached the porch. The stick was there, nailed beside the door frame, silvered with age, notched all along one edge in rows, that had gone soft and rounded with weather. The old woman stopped and put 2 fingers against it, the way a person touches something without deciding to. "It started here," she said, "before the snow came, before I knew what a man was worth." She opened the door. Inside, the kitchen was dim and smelled of wood smoke, and on the counter, though no one had said they'd be staying, 2 cups already sat out, waiting. "Sit," she said. "I'll tell it from the beginning." September 1863. The morning had come in gray, with a wind that carried the smell of iron before it carried snow. She had walked into Faro Gulch's general store with a list in her coat pocket and $11 owed already against her name in the ledger behind the counter. The clerk did not look at the list. He looked at the ledger and then at her, and said the words plainly enough that the 2 men by the stove stopped talking to hear them. No more credit. Not this season. She did not argue. Arguing in front of a room only gave the room more to remember. She counted what coin she had on the counter, watched him weigh it against what she needed, and left with 1 sack of grain in the wagon bed where there should have been 3. Outside, the wind had teeth in it already, coming down off the peak the way it did before the first hard snow, 3-4 weeks early, by any year she could recall. Her herd, 11 head, the whole of what she owned that still breathed, was up in the high pasture where she'd moved them for the late grass, and no way down but the 1 trail, and no way to walk that trail herself with a wagon full of nothing. She drove the road out of town slow, because there was no reason to hurry toward a problem that wasn't going to move. The house came up the way it always did, low and gray-boarded against the tree line, smoke already gone thin and dying in the stove she hadn't tended since dawn. She unhitched the horse herself. She carried the 1 sack in on her own shoulder because there was no one else to carry it, and she had stopped, some years back, waiting for there to be. Inside, She set the sack against the wall and stood a moment, looking at it, as though staring might make it into two. It did not. She thought of the herd, of the sky over the peak going the color of a bruise, of how many days she had before the pass sealed and the cattle either came down themselves, which they would not, cattle never did, not through drifts that deep, or stayed up there through a winter that would kill them one by one, the calves first. She had heard the name before, the way you hear a name that belongs to weather more than to a man. Said around the stove, said at the counter, said with a kind of respect people saved for things they didn't understand and didn't want to. He'd come down cattle off worse slopes than hers. For money, for grain, for whatever a rancher had left to give. She did not know yet what he looked like. She only knew, standing in her own kitchen, with 1 sack of grain and 11 days, at most, before the sky closed the mountain for good, that she was going to have to find out. The wind up here still carries that same bite in October. The niece pulled her collar up and said nothing, waiting. She found him on the road 2 days later, not the other way around. That was the part people got wrong when they told it, that she'd gone looking. She hadn't needed to. He was already coming down from the Delacroix place, and her wagon met his horse at the Narrows, where the road pinches between 2 stands of lodgepole, and he stopped without her asking him to. He sat the horse the way some men sit a chair they own, not proud, just settled. "You're the widow with cattle still up top," he said. "Not a question. I am. 11 head, last I heard." She didn't ask how he'd heard. Word moved through Faro Gulch faster than weather did, and by then everyone from the livery to the church steps knew her business better than she did some mornings. 2 sacks, he said. "I bring them down before the pass closes. You give me 2 sacks of grain. That's the price." He said it the way a man reads a fence line, flat, already decided, nothing in it, asking to be argued with. She sat with the reins loose in her hands and did the arithmetic she had already done twice at her own kitchen table. 1 sack in the barn, no coin worth mentioning. A herd that was, at that moment, the only thing standing between her and a spring with nothing to sell and nothing to eat through till it came. "I have one," she said. He didn't look away from her when she said it, which she noted, because most men did. Looked at the ground or the horse's ears. Anything but a woman admitting what she didn't have. 1 sack, he said, turning it over like a stone he was deciding whether to keep. "And a debt for the second, paid come spring, when I sell." The wind moved through the lodgepoles behind him. Somewhere above the tree line, the sky had already started going the color it would stay for the next 11 days, gray shading toward the bruised dark she'd watched from her window. He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd turn the horse, and that would be the end of it. She'd have imagined the whole exchange into something more promising than it was, the way desperate people did. Then he said, "I'll take the debt. But I eat supper at your table every night I'm working. Hot, not sent out to the barn." It was such a plain thing to ask for that she almost missed what was under it. A man naming the one comfort he wanted, and naming it like it cost him nothing to say, when anyone could hear that it did. "Done," she said, before she let herself think about why a man who could name his own price in grain would trade half of it for a chair at a stranger's table. She'd learn why. Not that day, not soon. She turned the wagon toward home, and he fell in behind her on the road, unhurried, like a man who had already decided how the winter was going to go. The wind had teeth in it by the time they reached the yard, and the niece pulled her collar up against it, watching the old woman's face for the rest of the sentence that didn't come. "That's it? Done, and he just rode behind you? Wasn't romance in it? Don't go painting it that way." The old woman's hand found the top rail of the fence. The wood silvered and split along its grain, and she held on the way she'd once held a wagon seat. It was a business arrangement between 2 people who'd both run out of better ones. But she remembered the yard that evening, the way she remembered little else from that year. The exact slant of the light, gray gold, dying fast the way November light did. She remembered setting a plate down in front of him without ceremony, the way she'd set it down for a hired man, though he was the first hired man she'd had in 2 years, and the first man at her table since the funeral. She hadn't thought, that first night, about what it would look like from the road. Faro Gulch was 3 miles off, but it had a long memory and longer ears, and by the second morning a wagon passed slow enough on the county road that she knew whoever was driving it had seen the extra horse in her corral and would carry the sight home like a piece of good beef. "They talked," the niece said. Not a question. They talked plenty. The old woman's mouth flattened, something between a smile and its opposite. A widow woman, alone on her place, taking on a man nobody else in 3 counties would hire, not because he wasn't capable, mind, but because of what he carried with him. That's a story a town doesn't let go easy, and I knew it, costing me something the moment I said done. Knew it costing him more. Why him more? Because I had a herd on a mountain and a debt to answer for. He had nothing to gain by taking work under a roof with a woman living alone in it, except talk. Men who'll do dangerous work for cheap pay don't usually ask to sit at the table doing it. That's what should have told me something. She looked out over the fence line, the 2 parcels running together now, seamless. No post or wire to say where one had ended and the other begun, 3 decades back. But I didn't ask. I was too busy being grateful I had a man riding toward my mountain instead of away from it. The wind picked up, carrying the first real cold of the coming evening, and the old woman turned her collar the same way the niece had, an old habit outlasting the need for it. Below them the valley held its long blue shadow, cattle scattered thin and dark against it, small as a memory. "First night," she said. "I didn't know a thing about him, didn't know why the offer cost what it cost. Just knew he ate like a man who hadn't had a hot plate put in front of him in longer than was decent, and didn't say thank you, and didn't need to." The niece said nothing, waiting the way young people learn to wait when they want an old woman to keep talking. The wind gave the old woman time to find the thread again. "Second morning he was there before I was," she said. "I hadn't heard a horse, just looked out the window and there he sat, already saddled, breath fogging, waiting on me to bring out coffee, like that was understood between us." She shook her head, more at herself than at the memory. "I hadn't understood any such thing, but I brought it out anyway." That became the shape of the days. He rode up while the sky was still more black than gray, and she kept a lamp burning in the kitchen window, so he'd have something to ride toward besides dark. She never asked him to come earlier or told him not to. He simply arrived, and she simply lit the lamp, and after 4 mornings of it, neither one questioned the arrangement any more than they questioned the mountain being where it was. She began setting 2 cups out before she started the coffee. The first few times she caught herself doing it, stood there looking at the second cup like it had appeared on its own, and put it back in the cupboard. By the end of the first week, she stopped catching herself. The cup simply stayed on the counter, waiting, the way the lamp waited, the way she found herself waiting, without naming it that. The tally stick hung by the kitchen door, a piece of scrap pine she'd notched herself the first night to keep account of what she owed him, and what he'd brought down. A notch for cattle delivered. A blank space, deliberately left, for the ones still up there. She took to marking the days, too, whether or not he came down with anything. A thin scratch for each morning he rode out toward the mountain, and each evening he rode back, because the debt was in the trying now, as much as the tally. 11 days, the old woman said. 11 notches before the mountain gave up more than 3 head at a time. I used to stand at that door counting them, like a woman counting money she didn't have, except it wasn't money I was counting. She touched her collar again, an old motion. It was whether he'd come back down at all. The niece looked at her, waiting for the rest. but the old woman had gone quiet, watching the shadow deepen over the valley floor where, 32 years gone, the herd had once stood scattered and freezing on a slope that didn't care what any of it cost anyone. "There was a night," she said finally. "The sky did something I hadn't seen it do before. Green at the edges. My mother used to say a green sky meant the mountain was deciding something." She exhaled, watching her own breath catch on the wind. "It decided that night." The old woman's hand found the fence post, steadying, though the wind wasn't strong enough to need it. "I went into town that week," she said. "Needed thread, needed salt, needed to stand in a room that wasn't my own kitchen for an hour." She said it like an apology, though the niece hadn't asked for one. The rancher who ran the biggest spread on the south end was at the counter. Man who'd never once offered me a fair price on anything, living or dead. She didn't say his name. She never had. He asked, after my health, the way men like that ask, like he already knew the answer and wanted to hear me say it wrong. Then, he asked if it was true I had that drifter working my mountain. A pause, dry as the wind. "Said it the way you'd say vermin." Said the man owed money all up and down the valley. Feed bills, a tab at the saloon nobody expected to see paid, and wasn't it a fine thing, a widow trusting her herd to a man who couldn't keep his own affairs straight. The niece's jaw tightened, 32 years too late to do anything about it. "I told him my affairs were mine to trust to whoever I liked." She almost smiled. "He didn't care for that. Men like that never do. So he kept talking, the way they do when they think silence is losing." Her eyes went to the valley floor again, to the place where the light had thinned to something the color of an old bruise. "He said the man used to run his own herd once. Small outfit, 2 winters back, up near the fork where the creek splits. Said he had a wife then, and a baby not yet a year old." The wind moved through the fence wire, a low sound, almost a voice. "Fever took them both inside of 9 days," she said. "The rancher told it like gossip, like weather, like it cost him nothing to say it out loud, in a room full of strangers. Said the man sold off every head he owned within the month, and hadn't kept so much as a chicken since. Said that was why he took work like mine, mountain work, dangerous work, work a man with something to lose wouldn't touch." She stopped. Said it like it explained something shameful, like grief was a debt too, and everyone could see he hadn't paid it off. She was quiet a moment, working her thumb along the grain of the post. "I didn't say anything back to that. Bought my thread, bought my salt." Her voice had gone flat and careful, the way it went when she was keeping something from breaking. "But I thought about it the whole ride home. About a man riding up a mountain every morning toward 11 head of cattle that weren't his. For a woman who couldn't pay him proper, because somewhere under all that quiet he didn't have anything left down here worth staying for." She looked at the niece then, sharp and sudden. "You understand that's not the same as pity." The niece said nothing. "I never once pitied him," the old woman said. "Not then, not after." Her eyes went back to the mountain, to the place where the sky, 32 years ago, had gone the color of something deciding. The color came on a Tuesday. She remembered that plainly, the way she remembered little else that fall, the date more than the feeling, because the feeling had gotten too big to keep whole. He'd gone up before light, same as every morning, cup of coffee standing untouched at the edge of the porch, because he never had time to drink it before he left. She'd watched him go from the kitchen window. By noon, the sky had turned the color a bruise goes when it's a day old, greenish at the edges, and by 2, the wind had teeth in it. She stood in the yard until her hands went numb, looking up at a mountain that had swallowed him whole. There was nothing to do. She knew that. A woman couldn't ride up after a man in a storm like that without becoming a second thing lost instead of one. So she went inside, and she built up the fire, and she sat at the table with the lamp, and she told herself she was only keeping it lit for the window, for anyone passing, for no reason at all. The wick burned low around 9. She trimmed it. It burned low again, past midnight, and she trimmed it again, her fingers steady out of habit, though nothing else in her was steady. The wind came down off the peak, in long throes, that made the whole house tick and settle, like something breathing. She did not sleep. She sat with her shawl pulled tight, and listened to 11 head of cattle she could not see, and a man she had no right to be listening for. And she trimmed the wick every hour on the hour, until she lost count of the hours. Toward morning, the wind dropped the way a fever breaks. All at once, with no warning it was going to. She sat in the sudden quiet and did not trust it. She went out at first light and stood at the fence and watched the trailhead the way she'd watch a door she expected bad news through. He came down a little after 7, 10 head, not 11, moving slow and strange with cold, and him walking beside them because his hands weren't fit to hold reins. She counted the cattle twice before she let herself count him. She did not go to him with words. She went to the tally stick by the kitchen door instead. Later, once he was inside and seated, and the coffee was in front of him, and she cut a notch for that night, the same as any other, except her hand went back and cut a second beside it, and a third, marking the hours she'd sat up, though there'd been no bargain that required it. It was the longest unbroken row the stick would ever carry. She touched it now, 32 years gone, tracing the place with one finger, though the wood there had long since silvered smooth, the notches worn to almost nothing. "That was the night I stopped keeping the tally for him," she said, "and started keeping it for myself." The niece said nothing, waiting for the rest of it, the wind picking up along the fence line, the way it had that morning, 32 years back. He'd stood at her door with his hat still on, which he never did, and she'd known before she looked at his hands that something in him had already given way to the cold and hadn't come back yet. She didn't ask him to sit. She pulled the chair out, and he sat, because his knees told him to more than his manners did. His fingers were the color of tallow, waxy at the tips, and when she took his right hand in both of hers, he made a sound low in his chest that wasn't quite a word. She didn't speak either. She filled the basin with water she'd had warming since she saw him on the trail, testing it twice against her wrist before she'd trust it near him, and she set his hands in it one at a time, slow, the way you'd lower something breakable into a nest of straw. He watched the water instead of her. She watched his face instead of the water. Neither of them said the calf's name, because it hadn't had one, and neither of them said the word frostbite, because saying it would have made it a thing that had happened to him instead of a thing he was still in the middle of. She worked a paste of lard and something bitter she kept in a tin without a label, worked it into the pads of his fingers with her thumbs, and he flinched once, sharp, and she didn't stop and didn't apologize for not stopping. The kitchen held the smell of the paste and the coffee and the wet wool drying by the stove, and under all of it the smell of a man who'd spent a night standing in snow up to his shins, so 10 animals that weren't his wouldn't be 9. When she wrapped the strips of clean cloth around each finger, she did it tight enough to hold and loose enough to let blood back in, and she knew how to do that because she'd done it once before, on hands that weren't his, in a life she didn't let herself walk back into, except at moments exactly like this one. He didn't thank her. She didn't tell him he was welcome. At some point his eyes closed, not from sleep, but from the particular exhaustion of a body deciding it was safe enough to stop bracing, and she let him sit like that a long while before she nudged the coffee an inch closer to his elbow with the back of her hand. "That was the morning," she told the niece now. "I understood a debt could get paid and never actually be settled. Some things you keep owing on purpose." She turned from the fence, started back down toward the house, and did not explain what she meant by that, though her feet already knew the path to the door well enough to walk it blind. The tally stick got its last notch on a Tuesday, 10 days after the mountain, and that should have been the end of it. It wasn't. He came back that Thursday to fix a gate hinge that had been fixed already. She watched him from the window, working the pin loose and setting it back the way it had been, and she didn't ask him what was wrong with it. Nothing was wrong with it. That wasn't the point of him being there. The following week it was the step, the one that had creaked since before her husband died, that she'd stopped hearing the way you stop hearing your own name after enough years of answering to it. He planed it down in an afternoon, quiet, methodical, like the wood had done something that needed correcting. She brought him coffee without being asked, and he drank it standing on the new step, testing it under his boot heel. "Wasn't broken," she said. "No," he agreed, and went to look at the barn latch next. By the time the first real snow came and went, melting into a false spring that fooled nobody, she'd stopped keeping track of what excuse he brought with him. A loose board, a window that stuck, a fence post leaning 2 degrees off true that had leaned that way for 6 years and troubled no one until he noticed it. She started leaving 2 cups on the counter before she heard his horse. The first time she did it, she stood looking at the second cup like it belonged to somebody who might still be coming through the door in some other version of her life. And she almost put it back in the cupboard. She didn't. She filled the coffee pot instead, and set it where the light from the window would fall across it. And when he came in stamping snow off his boots, he didn't ask why there were 2 cups, and she didn't tell him. It became the shape of an afternoon, his horse at the rail, her hand on the pot, 2 cups where before there had been 1, sitting out from the moment she woke, no longer a decision she caught herself in the middle of making, but a thing that had already been decided, somewhere she hadn't been watching. The tally stick stayed by the door. She didn't take it down. There was nothing left to mark on it, but it seemed wrong, somehow, to put it away, like filing off a scar because the wound had closed. He kept coming. She kept setting out the second cup. Neither of them called it anything. The porch step had been loose since November. He'd meant to get to it before the snow came, and then the snow came anyway, and it sat there, 1 board that gave a 1/2 inch under a boot, a small complaint of wood. He stepped around without thinking. Until the morning he didn't. The wind had died overnight. That kind of cold that comes after wind dies, still and complete. The kind that makes a nail feel like it might crack the board it's driven through. He knelt with the pry bar, and the cold had gotten into his hands again. Not like the mountain. Nothing like the mountain. Just enough to make the work slow. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over her shawl, watching the way she watched most things he did now. Not to check the work, but because there was nothing else she needed to be doing with her eyes just then. The niece asks her, at the fence line, if she remembers what he said. She says she remembers everything about that morning. The frost pattern on the window, the particular gray of the sky. She does not say the sentence out loud yet. She's not ready to hand it over. He pulled the old nail free, set the new board flush, started driving the nail in with 3 even strokes, unhurried, the way he did everything, and somewhere in the 3rd stroke he set it, without looking up from the wood. Said he hadn't had supper waiting on him at a table since his wife died. The hammer paused on the 4th stroke. Not long. A 1/2 second, maybe less. The space it takes a man to hear his own voice say a thing he hadn't decided to say. He didn't look up. She didn't move. The cold sat between them the way it had sat in the kitchen over his hands that first winter. Except now there was nothing to bandage, nothing to do with her own hands but hold still. 1 breath went out of her, slow, visible in the air. Then she turned back into the kitchen without a word and came out with the 2nd cup, the one that had been sitting on the counter since before dawn, and held it down to where he knelt. He took it, his fingers, still stiff from the cold, closed around the tin, the way they'd once closed around nothing, in that first year, when there had been no cup to hold at all. He finished the last stroke of the nail. Neither of them said anything else about it, but something in the porch step held differently after that, the way a thing holds once it has borne real weight, and she stood in the doorway a moment longer than she needed to before going back inside to the stove. The grain debt came due in March, when the runoff started, and the tally stick by her door had run out of room for new marks. She counted out what she owed him in her head a dozen times that week, figuring the sack against the labor, the frostbite, the calf lost in the storm. She never got the sum to feel even. He never asked for it. Instead, on a Tuesday, with mud still frozen in the ruts, he rode into town on the bay he'd had since before she knew him, and came back that evening on foot. She asked him where the horse had gone. He said he'd sold it. He didn't say what for, and she didn't press, though she noticed the money he carried after that sat differently in his pocket, like it had already been spent in his mind before it reached hers. 2 weeks later, a man from the land office rode out with papers, and she learned the horse had bought him a share of ground, hers, joined to what had been unclaimed scrub along her south line, filed under both their names before she'd said a word about it. She stood at the fence he started building that same week and did not tell him to stop. He set the posts himself, sinking them deep against the frost heave, running wire tight enough to sing in a wind. He didn't ask her opinion on the line. He didn't ask permission at all. He simply worked from first light until the light went, the way he'd worked the mountain that first winter, like the doing of it was its own kind of asking. She brought him coffee at midday. He drank it standing, looking down the new line of wire toward where her parcel ended and, by the paper now filed in town, no longer quite did. Neither of them called it anything. He never once asked if he could stay, the old woman says now, her hand resting on the top rail of that same fence, gray and split with age, but still standing, still straight. Men like that don't ask. They just start building, and you let it stand or you don't. The niece looks down the fence line, then back at her aunt. You let it stand. I let it stand, she says, and looks toward the ridge where the herd had come down 32 winters before, the pass long since grown over, the mountain unchanged. The wind picks up along the ridge, the way it does before evening comes down hard on the valley. The old woman turns from the fence and starts walking back toward the house, slow, her boots finding the same worn path they have found for 32 years. The niece follows. At the door she stops. There is a stick nailed beside the frame, gray as driftwood, its notches softened by weather until they are barely more than shadow. She does not look at it long. She does not need to. This came from that winter, she says, touching it once with 2 fingers, the way a person touches a thing they have touched 1,000 times before. 1 notch for every day he worked. The niece studies the marks. How many are there? 41. She says it without counting. I know, because I stopped needing to count a long time ago. She is quiet a moment. The wind moves through the yard, lifts a little dust, settles it again. He paid off the second sack by the 2nd week. She says, I told him he didn't owe me past that. He kept coming anyway. Her hand stays on the stick. The grain was never the thing he was paying. The niece doesn't ask what she means. She has heard enough of the story to know better than to ask. Come inside, the old woman says. Wind's turning. She pushes open the door. The kitchen holds the low gold light of late afternoon, dust turning slow in it, the smell of wood smoke and old pine boards. On the counter, near the stove, 2 cups sit side by side, plain tin, dented at the rims, set out the way they have been set out most evenings for longer than either of them has bothered to remember. The niece looks at them, then at her aunt, and says nothing. The old woman crosses to the stove and lifts the pot, not hurrying, Her movements economical the way they have always been. She fills one cup, then the other. Outside, past the window, the fence runs on toward the ridge, gray and split and still standing, joining two parcels that stopped being two parcels sometime around the second spring, though no one had ever written it down that way, and no one ever needed to. He'll be up from the lower pasture soon, she says, setting the pot back on the stove. She does not look at the tally stick again. She does not need to. She sets both cups on the table and waits.